So finally, India has its first comprehensive law on data privacy, the Digital Personal Data Protection Act 2023. In this video, we'll have a high-level look at this law. Hello, welcome to Wings to Eye Space, where we will discuss about significant and relevant aspects related to information security, data privacy, and compliance. I am Vinod Agrasala.
I am Rajesh Vasudevan.
India's first law on data privacy, the Digital Personal Data Protection Act 2023, is finally a law. The bill, which was passed in both the parliaments of India, was given a consent by the President of India on 11th August 2023. The bill is a very significant one for India, isn't it, Rajesh?
Before we discuss about the significance of the Act, Vinod, do you know there is a interesting relation between DPDPA Act and the place we are sitting, Bangalore?
Really? Oh, I didn't know that.
So, Vinod, the whole journey has been started in 2015. So, when the former judge of Karnataka High Court challenged in the Supreme Court against government collecting Aadhaar data of Indian citizens. Then that actually led to the 2017 landmark judgment from the Supreme Court, the Puttaswamy judgment. Government formed a committee called the Sri Krishna Committee to draft the data protection bill. And this committee provided that draft in 2018 to the government, and government tabled that in 2019, and it is then referred to the Joint Parliamentary Committee. So they provided the report with around 80 recommendations by end of 2021, and then government decided that okay, they will go for a new bill by scrapping the previous one. And in 2022, they introduced the draft bill, and now we have the final report. So I think that's the story. It all started from the Puttaswamy raising the concern in the Supreme Court. So now coming to the significance of this act, so this has a far-reaching impact on the people's concern about the privacy and the protection of their personal data.
In addition to that, there is a far-reaching impact on India's international posture as well, isn't it? Because this can have a significant effect on India's foreign policies, foreign trade, as well as business in general, global business in general. Because many of the regions, like many of the regulations like EU GDPR is looking for adequacy from the countries where the data can be transferred and all those things. So in a summary, this act can have a very far-reaching significance in India in terms of both internal, like you said about the people's concerns about privacy of their data, as well as international relations, trade, etc. Now, one more point we should highlight here is that even though we said 11th August 2023 is the date where the act was published, this act is not enforced on that date. So we need to highlight on that part as well, right? So this is not enforced yet.
Yeah, that's right, Vinod. So this is not going to be enforced immediately. So typically, okay, there is a period of 2 to 5 years for the implementation of different provisions of this particular act. So far, as per my understanding, so there is no notification from the government of India yet.
And one typical question which comes up is that why do we need that implementation period for such an act, and why can't it be on an in force from day one?
So the reason why the government is looking for an implementation period is that, as I said, 2 to 5 year period. If you look at from the government standpoint, they need around 2 to 3 years of time for implementation. One, they need to constitute a data protection board and the rules and regulations related to the data protection board, and also they need to appoint the officers and peoples in that office. And most importantly, the government has to frame around 26 rules related to this act. So hence, I think 2 to 3 years is a reasonable time frame for implementing this act.
Not only that, Rajesh, if you look at from the business and organization side who need to comply with the law, it can be little more complex and time consuming, right? To understand the law itself correctly, the requirements of the law, interpret the law requirements correctly, clarify any of the requirements if they need to, and then implement the systems, technologies, and practices what is required to comply with that. In some cases, it could be even to change their business practices or even stop some of the things what they're doing currently, right? So that 2 to 3 years is a kind of a fair assessment in terms of the implementation time. Yeah, I agree to that. Another important point I want to highlight in this discussion is that when such a regulation or even standards, in certain cases, when they are released, we have a tendency to jump right into the requirements of the law and see, and even compare with other international laws, saying that how it changes, what are the differences, what are the new things, what are the things which is removed, and then go into a comparative mode. But I think we should be little more rational there, because each country, their context in terms of political, social, economical status can be entirely different. What is the driver behind such a law? What are the policies of that country? What is the status of that country itself? That can be entirely different. So it's important for us to understand these preamble to that particular law, to understand the law, why it is framed in a certain fashion, right? So when you directly look at the act which is published on 11th of August 2023, we may not get that context. So it's very important for at least some of us to go and analyze the introductory sections of the bill itself, which gives a much more detailed information about what are the policies, what are the approach, or what are the context which was considered by the bill making itself, which has decided what should be included and what should not be included in this particular act. So that's very important, right? So basically, some of the things what this bill was looking at too is that while it is protecting the rights and freedom of people in India, it should not hinder or generate a dampener to the progress India is making as through the Digital India initiatives or as a global economy. So that's very clearly mentioned in the preamble of the bill, and that shows that there is a balanced approach taken by India towards the introduction of the bill. That's very important for us to keep in mind, why to understand the bill correctly.
That's correct, Vinod. There are a few other features I would like to highlight, because when I read the act first time, the first thing which caught my eye is the simplicity of the act. So it is very simple and it is very short. And if you look at it, it is only 22 pages long. Compared to GDPR or even our previous data protection bill, it is very short. So any layman can go through that and understand the gist of the act. So that is point number one. Point number two is, Vinod, as you said, this is a very complex environment, right? So our lawmakers had taken a very, very pragmatic approach throughout the bill. For example, they even call out a digital office for the DPO. So meaning all the transactions can happen over a digital platform and reducing the implementation time, etc. So throughout, you can see a pragmatic approach on this legislation. And the third point is, it's a principle-based approach. So it is not a prescriptive act like GDPR or any other legislation. So why this is important is that actually give a lot of flexibilities in terms of implementing this act in a complex scenario like ours.
Right. So before we close this episode, can we look at some of the very high level points that caught our attention about this act in our first read of the act itself? So I'll start with one of the thing I've observed in terms of the data protection principles, the rights to data subject. Obviously, there are plus and minus compared to some of those other acts. But there are overall alignment with global acts like GDPR. So which will enable one of the objective of having improved, foreign relationship, international business, trade, etc. So that's one of the thing I noticed onto this.
So one other key thing is this particular act is limited to only the digital personal data. So unlike the other, the previous versions of this bill, it was actually covering the non-digital also. So now the implementation of this act will be much more easier and simpler.
Yes, like some of the other acts, there is also specific provisions with respect to processing of children's personal data. When it comes to children's personal data, in comparison with some of the global regulations like GDPR, the age which is specified for the age limit which is specified for the children is 18 as per this law. So there have been specific provisions given with some future enhancement provisions as well in the act for the children's data processing.
Then this particular bill has completely taken out the further classification of your personal data. So like sensitive personal data or critical sensitive personal data, etc. And again, as I said earlier, it's a very pragmatic approach by looking at the complexity of the data points in a country like India where we have 1.4 billion people. This is actually very, very important, okay, from a implementation standpoint.
Yes, and one more prominent thing which I noticed is about the way this act deals with the international data transfer and processing of Indian personal data outside India. So in the previous drafts and how the other acts are looking at in terms of controlling where you can transfer the data, how you can transfer data, where it can be processed, etc. One interesting thing this act has done is that instead of looking to control everything that way, they've looked at a negative list way of controlling the data processing outside India, which means you're free to process and transfer the data anywhere across the globe unless there are specific regions and countries which is prohibited explicitly by the government. So the government is only going to maintain those specific regions and countries list where you are prohibited from transferring or processing personal data from India. I think that's much more rational and pragmatic approach, especially considering the state India is in today.
And then you have a very, very unique provision here for the duties for the data principal. I think this is the first for any data privacy act across the world. Here the data principal has some obligations like they should not hide any information, or the information what they are providing should be accurate and consistent. So this is another important point I would like to highlight.
Yeah, of course, on top of this, there are certain levels of criticisms and then complaints about in various fronts which has been raised about this act from a political or social perspective. We are not getting into those because that's not the point of discussion for us here today.
So these are some of the key aspects we wanted to cover in this video.
We will have another detailed discussion about the specific requirements of this act and how it compares with some of the other global acts like GDPR in a future video.
And we wanted to hear from you. So if you have any specific queries and clarifications, please leave your comment in the comment section.
So we'll see you in another useful video as a part of Wings to a Space. Till then, goodbye.